Good evening and welcome once again to another program of Issues in the News, where we discuss the important events that would have taken place in Guyana over the past week or so. And as is the norm, we have a packed agenda of issues to discuss. I want to begin by welcoming our viewers who are joining us on television from region number 5, West Coast, Berbice. Welcome to another program of Issues in the News. And also from Region 6 across the Berbice River, along the east bank of the Berbice River, from New Amsterdam and all those villages along the east bank of the Berbice River, Kanji, all the way along the Quarantine Coast, and as far as Oriala Siparuta. Those of you who are joining us on television from that region, region number 6, welcome to another program of Issues in the News. And to our listeners and viewers who are joining us on Freedom Radio from Robb Street, Georgetown, welcome to another program of Issues in the News. And last but not least, to the thousands of you who are joining us on Facebook Live, right across the length and breadth of Guyana, the Caribbean, North America, Europe, Asia, and as far as the Middle East and Australia. Welcome to another program of Issues in the News. Shamo Gir, Danwanti Lautan, David Simon, Naraindat Sharma, Abdul Qayyum Haq, Pamela Pasad, Lachman Dioraj, and all of you good people. Welcome to the program and share the live. Share this program so that your friends and your followers can join us in tonight's discussion. Press that share button on your phone, on your computer, on your laptop, on your iPad, or whatever device you are viewing the program on. Share the live so that all your viewers, all your followers, all your friends can join us in tonight's discussions. And also please engage me on the comment section. Let me hear your views. Let me read your views. Let me read your comments. Let me read your questions so that I can answer and we can have an involved engagement. Thank you once again, and let's start. So I have received a question from the press, and it's an important question. The question essentially relates to an incident which was reported in the news media, whereby a person was locked up by the police because that person had in his possession some 15 gram or less than 15 grams of marijuana. The police apparently locked up the man. Now, as you know, in November 2022, we amended the Narcotics and Psychotropic Substances Control Act by amendment number, I don't have the amendment number here, but by those amendments, we sought to remove mandatory custodial sentences in respect of possession of marijuana up to 30 grams. So if you have 30 grams and less, a magistrate cannot impose a penalty of imprisonment. The amendments divide possession into two categories. If you have 0 to 15 grams, then you can be charged, but the penalty is mandatory counseling. And if you have 15 grams but less than 30 grams, the penalty is community services. The magistrate can order you to do community services. So there is no mandatory imprisonment. In fact, there is no imprisonment in respect of possession of narcotics below 30 grams. If the court cannot sentence you at the conclusion of a trial, or if you plead guilty, if the court cannot sentence you to a term of imprisonment, then the police cannot lock you up for that offense. And that's a principle of law that runs across every offense in the statute books of our country. If the offense doesn't carry imprisonment when you are found guilty, then obviously, prior to your being found guilty, you cannot be locked up. So the police officers are hereby advised that they are not to detain persons in the lockup for possession of marijuana below 30 grams. They must grant bail and they must charge and put the person before the magistrate's court. And that applies to all offenses. If an offense doesn't carry a term of imprisonment, then the police cannot deny that person bail. Bail is eminently grantable for those types of offenses. I repeat, the principle is that if you cannot be found guilty and jailed at the conclusion of your case, or if you plead guilty, then a police officer has no power and authority to put you in the lockup for that offense when you are arrested. You are entitled to bail. So I thought I would clear that up immediately. I want tonight to focus on accountable and transparent governance, because that is a fundamental ingredient of good governance and a fundamental ingredient of a democracy. Democracy is not only free and fair elections, but also involves governing in a particular manner, governing with due accountability, due transparency, and in a responsible manner. And that includes the enactment of laws that would ensure transparent governance and accountable governance. And if one examines the PPP civic government of any period, but let's confine our analysis tonight from August 2020 to now, one would see all the elements of accountable governance, of responsible governance, and of transparent governance. All the checks and balances that are in the Constitution are functional and functioning. The service commissions are there. The Auditor General Office is fully financed and operates in an independent manner. And does the government audits the government public expenses and hands a report annually to the Parliament, not the government, for the Parliament to send it to a Public Accounts Committee chaired by the opposition for the purpose of scrutiny. You have a Parliament that sits at periodic intervals, and you have a committee system in that Parliament that is functioning. You have that Parliament passing laws by the government or laid by the government, but those laws include hundreds of mechanisms and provisions to keep the government accountable. And then on the other side, on the other branch, you have a judiciary that is certainly independent of the executive and certainly is not unwilling to rule against the government, as you have seen. I give you that overview to establish that what we have in Guyana is an accountable, transparent, democratic government. Let's take the oil and gas sector. The most important sector in the economic and financial landscape of the country. We have had multiple challenges by members of the public to various aspects of this sector. They have challenged the EPA grant of environmental permits and the performance of the EPA's functional responsibilities. They have challenged the validity of the contract under which the oil operators function. They have challenged the type of assurance or insurance that is required under the law. They have challenged a whole host of other areas of the sector. Every single challenge was thrown out by the court. They have challenged the legality of the Natural Resources Funds Act. That was also thrown out by the very courts that I'm speaking about. A court system that is not, as I said, unwilling to rule against the government when such a situation presents itself. Again, I give you that overview to establish the thesis that I want to advance, that there is accountable and democratic government functioning in Guyana. In terms of the financial flow of revenue from the oil and gas sector, we have a Natural Resource Fund Act that comprehensively outlines how the monies are to be deposited into a special fund and how the monies are to be withdrawn from that fund. All withdrawals must be made public by a publication in the official gazette and can only be spent with the approval of the National Assembly and can only be spent for the purposes laid out in the Act itself. And any violation carries prison terms. And within the governance structure of the legislation, there are layers and layers of accountability in terms of boards and authorities established within the Act. This piece of legislation has been examined by critics of the government, and it has been examined by our courts, and it has been examined by international agencies who are specialized in examining legislation of this type. And as a model, it has won the approbation of all these agencies that have subjected it to scrutiny. In addition to that, we enacted a local content law to protect local labor and local employment opportunities. And you are aware of the billions of dollars that legislation has been able to yield to the local private sector and local people participating in the industry. Tens of thousands of persons have gained employment. We have said that after a period we will review the local content legislation. And the review is ongoing, and we will bring amendments to the National Assembly in due course. We promise a different statutory framework that will govern PSAs, production sharing agreements, going forward, because innumerable criticisms emanated and still continue to emanate from the PSA under which the operators function. We readily concede that the statutory infrastructure that was in place to govern the oil and gas industry was totally inadequate. And we hired expert help from both the United Kingdom and the United States. And we have a new Petroleum Activities Act. Again, that act was scrutinized by all the critics. It went out to public consultations. And I have not heard a valid criticism yet of that piece of legislation. It's modern, it's comprehensive, it speaks to from the time the process begins in terms of qualification to bid for oil blocks. It deals with exploration, it deals with production, it deals with post-production, it deals with environmental issues, and a whole host of other things. It deals with a different regime for the state to benefit from oil production, a different regime of payment of royalties, a different profit-sharing arrangement. It doesn't exempt the wide variety of taxes that the current PSA does. So it's a far more advanced and equitable piece of legislation when compared to its predecessor. And as I have said, even the critics of the government have given it its plaudits. And then we have government functioning. We have a cabinet that sits regularly, chaired by the president himself. all ministers are part of this cabinet. On a regular basis, the president would bring together the permanent secretaries, all of them, and place them before cabinet. And the cabinet would have discussions in respect of accountable government, transparent government, democratic government. Every minister is required, as per an instruction from the president, to meet with the senior management team of their respective ministries to ensure that projects' time frames are met and that the laws which govern procurement and govern the execution of these contracts are scrupulously followed. We have established a unit within each ministry and a unit at the Attorney General chambers to address the issue of breach of contracts in relation to the government's PSIP program, the government's infrastructural development program. On a regular basis, the president himself would meet management teams from the various ministries and public corporations such as GWI, Gaisuku, and of course the various ministries, top managers, and speak to them directly about their conduct, about accountable governance and the behavior, and to ensure that the laws of the country are complied with, and to speak obviously about corruption, about allegations of corruption, etc. This is not a one-off activity. This is a continuous part of governance which we engage in. The Vice President wears two caps. He's the General Secretary of the governing party as well as the Vice President of the country. And wearing those two caps, he also has been part of this process. And if you listen to many of his press conferences, he addresses these very matters, and he would address also allegations of corruption that are made. The Vice President has been traveling to all the regions as well, and so has the President, meeting with the regional officials who deal with contracts at the regional level and at the regional tender board level, and meeting the officers there and having a similar conversation with them. Today, the Vice President had a very important engagement at the Artachong Convention Center, in which he brought together the creme de la creme of the administrative management of the country, from the tender board to the evaluators to all the permanent secretaries, all the regional executive officers, the senior officials of the ministry and state agencies, all the corporations and commissions such as the Guyana Geology Commission, the Guyana Sugar Corporation, GWI, GPL, the Guyana Police Force, the Guyana Defense Force, all the accounting officers and managers of all these agencies, and had an entire day session with them to speak specifically on management of responsibilities, conduct, procurement matters, what are the do's and what are the don'ts, what is prohibited and what is permissible. And there is a news story that I read, generated, I think, by the Department of Public Information, capturing the discussion between the Vice President and the confabulation which attended. And everyone in this country should read the frank discussions which were had, in particular as it relates to procurement. The point was made that 95% of all public procurement and execution of public contracts go well. 95% go well. Sometimes we don't make this point enough. But in any given organization, more so a country, you would have shortcomings. So you have an average of about 5% of these contracts that may attract problems, that may attract controversies. And we don't turn a blind eye to them. We have never said, and we will never say, that we run a perfect government. A perfect government does not exist. So we understand that there are problems. But what are we doing about it? And everything that I've outlined to you there, from the beginning of this program to now, is to establish to you what we are doing to ensure, as far as possible, that we have responsible and transparent government in this country. Today, the Vice President spoke about bribery. He spoke about allegations of corruption. He spoke about family getting contracts. He spoke about not aggressively policing contracts. He spoke about he spoke against restrictive tendering. He spoke about contractors being in violation and engineers not being as vigilant and as professional as they should, because they are the government's representatives on these contracts. He spoke about conflict of interest. He spoke about imposing penalties for shoddy work and terminating contracts where such a situation warrants termination. Why are we doing all of this? If we were not interested in accountable governance and responsible governance, why are we doing all of this? If we are one big corrupt cabal and we encourage nepotism and we encourage corruption and we encourage graft, everything that I have said to you there is factual, and I've been speaking for 32 minutes. Every single statement I have made is a factual one. Is this the approach of a government that is encouraging corruption, or is in conspiracy with corrupt practices, you can judge for yourself. And there is a great effort by the opposition to distort the history of this country. So they would magnify a particular issue and they would speak about it for days, and they would not reflect. And in so doing, they distort the facts and the truth. But they would never want to go back to their record. They would never tell you and tell the young people of this country that for 10 or more years, there was no Auditor General report generated. You can't believe that. For 10 or more years, there was no Auditor General report generated. And that was a directive from the Ministry of Finance to the Auditor General Office that they must not audit the public accounts of this country. So for 10 years, nobody knew how a dollar was being spent. And for many of those years, Nandlall Saran, today one of the most prominent critical commentator against this government, was situated in a high post in that very audit office. In fact, he became Auditor General. He was Deputy Auditor General for many of the years that no Auditor General report was generated in this country. And he writes an article every week about accountability and transparency. That is what you have here. There was no system by which public procurement was done in this country. Nobody knew how a contract was awarded when the PNC was in government. Nobody knew. You don't know how much a project cost. You don't know how the contractor got it. Nothing. And the PNC today wants to lecture us about transparency and about accountability. And the AFC is no different. Imagine we never had any public procurement process. And dozens of properties were sold under Desmond Hoyt without any form of bidding whatsoever. The agreement of sale used to be signed by Mr. Desmond Hoyt's secretary. When all the rice mills were sold to a leasing group of companies, all the rice mills that were owned by the state were sold to the Surinamese, a leasing group of companies, and all the agreements of sale were done at Mr. Hoyt's office, signed by his secretary for the president. No public procurement, no public process, none. No advertisement was put up, nothing. Nobody knew what was the price, and you couldn't ask. You'll get locked up if you ask. Demerara Woods, GT&T, it used to be Telecoms, Guy Stack, and all these places were sold out. Nobody knew. And today these people want to rewrite history. And I'm not only going to even deal with rig elections, I'm dealing with accountable governance and government. Today, they want to tell you that they are the barometer. They are the moral police when it comes to accountability and transparency. But let's forget the dictatorial, horrid past and let us fast forward to when they took government again in 2015. AFC and APNU. And the AFC, they want to rebrand themselves as now they just come. They don't want you to remember that they were part of a government that was just here 4 years ago. So when they won the elections in 2015, they held a grand inauguration ceremony. Well, grand inauguration ceremonies. One at the parliament when the president was sworn in. Then they had a big inauguration at the National Stadium where they had thousands of people. They brought in thousands from the United States, from Canada, from England, from across the Caribbean. And the big fete and sport they had, the whole country shut down. Big fete and sport inauguration gala at the National Stadium. Up to now, we don't know how much that cost. Up to now, they never said how much that cost. And then when they finished there, the following night, they took over the whole of the Pegasus. And they danced whole night at the Pegasus Hotel. We never got those bills. Nobody knew or still don't know how much those events cost. I was going through my notes and I remember Mr. Granger hiring nearly 100 advisors. You all remember that? 33 foreign advisors, 33 foreign advisors, and 70-something local ones, nearly 100 advisors. I remember one of them was an advisor for some sporting facilities. Those things, we never know the salary of none of these advisors. Can you remember Basil Williams having 5 advisors one time? 5 retired judges were advising Basil Williams. 5 advisors he alone had. Granger had 100. Nobody know. They never disclosed those people's salary. And today, Mr. Winston Jordan speaking about wastage. I could do an entire program on him alone. On him alone. This guy, the finance minister, speaking about wastage. You can remember when they shut down the specialty hospital at Torkine and they handpicked a company called Federal Lloyd. Feathers Lloyd, Ramjatan's client, they handpicked him, that company, and gave them the contract. And later on it was found out that Feathers Lloyd was blacklisted by the IDB. And the project was shut down. Up to now, we don't know how much money Feathers Lloyd was paid. But after he was blacklisted by the IDB, the Indian bank shut the project down. Never disclosed to us or to the people how much money was paid to Feathers Lloyd. Feathers Lloyd. And then you remember their increase in salary. They got into government in May and they increased their salary in September, but backdating it up to June of the very year. So they never worked a day but raised their salary by 50%. And then who can forget the Durban Park project, where, and it is important that we reflect on these things. Sometimes, we forget. Could you imagine that they incorporated a company right at the office of the president? They incorporated a company and they made themselves directors and shareholders. Rupert Rupnarain, Larry London, Bobby Vera, they were the owners of the company, and they give themselves the contract to do the Durban Park. Over $1.2 billion was spent on Durban Park. A company whose registered office is in the office of the president and owned by a clique in the office of the president. They did the contract for the Durban Park. The Auditor General still can't find $650 million. And Jordan, speaking about wastage, they want you to forget these things. But we can't forget them. Then let us go to the Rudisa case. Remember, we had a case in the court when we were a minority government whereby Rudisa sued the government of Guyana because we didn't we didn't amend the Customs Act to allow them to bring in their drinks and their beverages without paying an environmental tax, because it was a CARICOM product. It's coming from Suriname. And under the Treaty of Chaguaramas, the provisions are, and the obligations of the countries are, that we must have tax-free trade in respect of goods that originate within the CARICOM region. And we had a law on the statute books in the Customs Act that imposes an environmental levy on the bottles coming from Suriname. The people took us to the Caribbean Court of Justice, and we didn't have a defense because that is what the treaty says that we must do. I asked the court to adjourn the case, and I took a bill to the parliament to amend the law to remove the offensive provisions. Rudisa said that once we remove it, they will withdraw the case. They voted down the law using their one-seat majority. I went back to the court. I asked the court for another opportunity to put back the law in the parliament. The court adjourned again. We put back the law in the parliament. They voted down the law again, forcing us to be in breach. We had to end up paying that company 6 point something million. 6 point something million US. And as soon as they got into government, they paid. Many of them were driving Kia cars. That very company sold Kia or are still selling Kia cars in this country. That debt, that judgment was paid in record time. They call in several companies, large companies, I don't want to call a company's name, and they wrote off billions and billions of dollars of taxes at the GRA level. Billions of dollars in taxes. Go back and read the articles in the newspapers. Go back and read the articles in the newspapers and you will see what I'm speaking about. Then the Hagbosh. I remember the Hagbosh. When we were in government, we had terminated the contract with BK International because they were not building the Hagbosh. We terminated the contract and we filed proceedings for breach of the contract. We sued BK International. By that time, BK had become their body friends. We sued BK, listen to me carefully, we sued BK International for breach of contract for the Hagbosh project. We terminated the contract and sued the contractor. When they got into government, they settled the case by paying the contractor $7 billion, $6.5 billion. You hear what I'm saying? We sued the contractor because the contractor was in breach. They settled the case by paying the contractor $7 billion and the contractor never did the work. They withdrew a case that we had filed and they settled and paid $6.5 billion to that contractor. And Jordan, speaking about wastage, I am not finished. Who can forget the drug bond at Sussex Street, where again they rented a house at Sussex Street, a wooden house, for 12.5 million Guyana dollars per month. A couple months before, the man who rented the house to them, one of their cronies, the man purchased the property. The man purchased the property for $22 million. You hearing me? $22 million the man bought the whole property for. They rent that same property for $12.5 million a month and pay the man 6 months' rent in advance. So the 6 months' rent in advance, the man was able to pay off for the entire property and collect how many months' rent in advance. They paid over $400 million in rent for a house. And you know, when we went from the parliament one night to visit the house, because they said they had drugs and pharmaceuticals in there, all we found was a couple boxes of condoms. They were storing a couple boxes of condoms in a house that they rented for $12.5 million, raking up a total rental bill of $400 million by the time they terminated the contract. In fact, the contractor sued, the landlord sued our government, and I went to court and I won the case. The man sued for the balance of the purchase, the rest of the rent, because he rented for a long period. And the man was claiming he needed rent for the entire period. And Jordan speaking about wastage. How can we forget that incident when Minister of Health Walter Lawrence marched into the public hospital and determined that public hospital is a corporation. It is run by a board. It has a chief executive officer. And Walter Lawrence, as the minister, marches into public hospital and instructed the CEO and the chairman of the board, I think, to go and buy drugs from Ansa Makal for $570 million without a single resort to public procurement. Instruction by the minister, go and buy the drugs now from that company. It turned out that the drugs are only valued about 300 million. So 250 million was excess. They said that they had to fly the drugs in. I don't think the plane cost so much. The value of the aircraft that fly the drugs in cost so much. Not a single resort to the Public Procurement Act or processes. Minister instructing. Remember, they spent $240 million to refurbish Kitty Market. Remember again, no public procurement. 240 million doled out to repair Kitty Market, and then the market collapsed shortly after. The market collapsed shortly after. Then I come to Patterson, taking $260 million from the Harbour Bridge account and handing it to a French company to do a feasibility study. He did not even inform his own cabinet. Can you believe that? This fellow never informed his own cabinet. He took $260 million out of the Harbour Bridge account and paid a French company to do a feasibility study for the Harbour Bridge. The feasibility study came back with a twisted Harbour Bridge with 3 lanes. 3 lanes. And that's what we paid $260 million for. Of course, I could recite the motion scales, where they bought the motion scales from the campaign manager of the AFC from Jamaica. The agreement of sale says that you must pay 50% down, and when the motion scale comes, you pay the other 50. Patterson paid the entire amount and never received the scale. Never received the scales. When we filed criminal charges, then we heard that the scale is in a bond at La Parcan, and then the bond erupted in fire. That was only while we were in government. The bond disappeared in fire, so the scale got bought out. And these guys talking about transparent and accountable government. I see persons are telling me about the barber chairs. Let me talk about that. Christopher Jones, he applied for a grant at the Ministry of Social Services to open a barber shop. After he collected the money, $6 million he collected by barber chairs. Then they told him that you got to go and register a business. He then went and registered a business. The chairs can't be found. And he said he's doing it for the community. He then went and he got a piece of land at Ramvelt, at Aubrey Barker Road. You know where the health center is? The government health center. And there's a man selling dog food somewhere there. He got his friend Trevor Ben. And Trevor Ben gave him title to a land, which is the health center land. He got title for the Ministry of Health Center. The same Christopher Jones. We took it back, obviously, when we got into government. And then I see somebody writing about Patterson and the Bangle. Him and Annette Ferguson, they get gifts from King's Jewelry, bangles. We saw the gift certificates. We had to produce it in Parliament. And Patterson said he doesn't wear bangles. It's not true. Until the people produce. They produce the receipt that the bangles was bought. With the Harbour Bridge money. And these guys got a straight face and can speak to you about accounting governance, accountable governance and responsible governance, and they want to lecture to us. I can go on and on. The airport, we negotiated to build an airport. They call in the contract when we come out of government and renegotiated. You listen to this. They renegotiated the contract. And the contract price increased, but the size of the airport decreased. We had a turnkey contract. They called in the contractor when they won the government and they said they want to renegotiate. They ended up with a larger contract price and a smaller airport. And they want to speak about accountable government and transparent government. Basil Williams is sitting Attorney General, attempted to steal the land next door owned by Clarissa Reel, their own member. Clarissa Reel land is next door to the Attorney General chambers. And that fella put an advertisement in the official gazette to compulsorily acquire the lady property and did not even tell her. The lady I read the thing in the newspapers and in the official gazette. And today they are throwing stones at us about compulsory acquisition. Clarissa Reel is still around. She can speak. How they tried to steal her property. She was in Canada as their High Commissioner. And Basil Williams, barefacedly, just want to steal the lady property. Because that is how Burnham used to do it. You want a piece of property, you take it. Because they felt that they had owned Guyana. Today it is different. I wish if I had more time to continue. But my operator has signaled to me that we have approached program time now. But I'm sure that I have left with you a lot of information. Information that you may have forgotten. And you note, I only dealt with about 2 years of their government. Only about 2 years of their government. I didn't go beyond 2017. I could spend several hours on these people. And Jordan and Nigel Hughes want to walk around and speak about accountable governance. I began the program by showing you what we are doing and what we will continue to do. And then I give you what existed before so that you can appreciate a contrast. I want to thank you very much. Cricket is going to be with us. I'm not sure whether there is any cricket match next week, Tuesday, but if there is, then we will not have the program. I'm a big fan of the Amazon Warrior, and hopefully we will take the trophy once again. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the evening and stay safe until we meet again. Thank you.